we're going to talk specifically about the economy, and that means money. And of course, money is a subject that women traditionally have been excluded from in so many ways. Historically, they didn't own it. In fact, often they were property, our property. They were excluded from the ideas of having bank accounts. They were excluded from the idea of being able to invest. And all of that idea that somehow money is not for them or about them, that goes very deep inside people's consciousness. And it's hard to change. But what we do know at this time of COVID is that the real debris that's going to be left on the beach is the evidence that women's financial circumstances are so vulnerable, they are so unthought about, they're so unpaid, undervalued, etc., in so much of the work that they do. And yet, at the same time, they are massive consumers and massive spenders in a world economy that doesn't really think about them in a respectful and thoughtful way. We're going to be talking to three women who've given their careers and their minds and their values to considering how we make a big change in the language that we use to speak about women and to plan for women and to plan in finance. We're going to talk to Arlene, Laura, and Sandie. I call them all by their first names because we're not only here with our jobs, but we're here just to be women. But let me just give you their kind of hugely important professional titles. Arlene Isaac Lowe. Hello, Arlene. You there? Is Global Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at the Moody's Corporation USA. And indeed, Moody's are one of the sponsors of this 24-hour global. Hello, Arlene, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jude. Thank you for having me.
I'll come back to you in a second. Then we're going to say hello to Laura Mackenzie, who's the Senior Vice President of the Global Prepaid and Financial Inclusion of Mastercard, another one of our sponsors. Just say hello, Laura. I'll come back to you again in a minute.
Hello, you there? Jude, and thank you so much for having me.
Good to see you. And then finally, and not least, is Sandie Okoro. She's the Senior Vice President and General Counsel for the World Bank Group and Vice President for Compliance at the World Bank. Sandie, we've been friends for years. It's great to have you on this panel.
Hi, Jude. It's great to be back. Thank you.
So, Arlene, I'd like you to take us through, as one of the most senior women in the world, actually, I'll say that, thinking as you do about the whole area of finance and compliance and bringing together economies at this point when Black Lives Matter has insisted that we think about intersectional justice. Can you tell us why economies have been so bad at including Black and women of color, and why we now need to plan differently, completely differently, and what language and change we need to see to make that happen?
Certainly. First of all, Jude, thank you for inviting me to participate in what is a tremendous event. And we are really thrilled to be able to sponsor this event because it is so important that we collaborate from a global perspective. In my role as Global Head of Corporate Social Responsibility at Moody's, one of the things that we looked at was in thinking about what our role was in terms of societal impact and citizenship, really, how do we provide information and resources that would enable women and people from underserved communities to really have the tools they need to succeed. And that is really the essential underpinning of our corporate social responsibility strategy. A key pillar of that is around economic empowerment for women and underserved communities. Certainly the intersection of what we're seeing today in regards to those segments that are most adversely impacted by the turbulent events of the world. We first had the pandemic that has certainly caused a lot of health or revealed the disparities the health disparities for Black people, but also for women specifically, in that they tend to be on the front lines of the healthcare workers. That was then followed by a devastating economic downturn that we're still in the midst of. And then finally, or hopefully, finally, what we have is the culmination of the racial injustices in the United States, particularly on the killing of Black people, which has really enraged the world, as we saw the video of George Floyd. And it has really sort of revealed the racial injustices that Black people in the United States face, but certainly that Black people all over the world face. And so you have the culmination of a number of turbulent events, all of which is causing even more disparity, particularly for women of color, and particularly Black women. When you talked about sort of the role of women in terms of the economic power that they have. And I think it's important that we understand, what's going on in regards to the research. So we know that if women were able to, or if we were able to solve the gender disparity around the world, we would be able to generate about $28 trillion in GDP by 2025, which is significant. We also know that women have about $20 trillion in purchasing power around the world. So while we may think we're not empowered, we are very much empowered, because much of the buying decisions around the world are made by women. Our focus is essentially on small and growing businesses owned by women and owned by women of color. And what we face there is that despite the great ideas that women have, they have access to less than 2% of the available capital. And there's a $1.2 trillion credit gap that women who own businesses face. And so as compared to if we were able to solve the disparity between female entrepreneurs and male entrepreneurs, we would be able to generate $3 to $5 trillion per year in GDP. And I mentioned those stats because, one, we're a very data-driven organization, and much of what we do is a function of research. But it also is a proof point that if women were provided the opportunities that men were in terms of entrepreneurship, it would not only be good for women, and particularly women of color, but it would be good for the world. Yet there is a significant resistance because of biases that women face as they seek to access capital and as they seek to access markets in order to grow successful businesses. So I think today, given everything that has been unveiled, we certainly have an opportunity to be responsive in an impactful way. We should focus on what the benefits are of equitable availability of capital and market access would be for women-owned businesses, because we would all certainly benefit. The other thing that I would like to mention is we've also proven that when women-owned businesses succeed, not only do they succeed, but their communities succeed, because they spend disproportionately on the health and education of their children. And so I would say that it is beneficial to all of us in the world, if we were to support women-owned businesses and their and the benefits of them having greater capital access.
That's great, Arlene, and it's great to have the data. I mean, especially when the data tells you not just what you sort of knew, but it rams it home, because the statistics are really dreadful. By the way, people on watching with us, when you get to the end of this discussion, pop onto the website to look at the WOW Marketplace, co-created with WOW and Janet's List. It's all women-led businesses, Black women and women of color-led businesses, all fantastic entrepreneurs with social purpose. Look at what they're doing, buy the product. It's Black Pound Day in the UK, and we need to support the Black Pound, and not just the upfront businesses, but also the supply chains. We need to look at all our supply chains and work out who is getting the benefit from the money as it runs through the system. Laura, I'm going to come to you next. I recently became involved in something called Smart Purse, which was looking at financial education for women, because it became clear to me, myself as a white woman, but a woman of third generation immigrant family, never really brought up to think that money was my thing, or that I sort of was supposed to have it particularly, but rather than just like getting by. Not really of a generation where women were told to think about money in a kind of clever way. I never assumed that, my job was to ever invest in anything or understand the markets. All of the things that just suddenly occurred to me recently was a way of keeping me in ignorance. So it's all very well having the tools to succeed, but you've also got to know that you want them and need them. So, I mean, a lot of your work is about how do we create proper financial inclusion? And tell me about the work that you're up to in Mastercard and the detail of it, because it's quite complex, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it is, Jude, and thank you so much again for the introduction. You hit on a couple of really important themes. You hit on tools, and I'll start there in a second. But you also opened up with something, that and we largely, those of us speaking on this panel today, are in mature and thriving economies. We've got virtually everything that we need at our disposal. But if we think to our mother's generation and our grandmother's generation and their mother's generations, right, exactly what you've described, they were raised in a society where their husband, the man, would go off and he would be the breadwinner and he would take care of things, and don't worry your pretty little head over it. And I think that exactly what you've described, the not a generation or a world full of sort of quote unquote helpless women. But that's not the world we live in anymore. And we certainly know that women, and you mentioned it early on, the buying power that they collectively have around the globe is in the trillions of dollars. The decision making and the buying influence that they have around the globe is significant. So I'm going to go back and start for a second, because you're exactly right. At Mastercard, we've actually been on a long journey. We have been focused on financial inclusion and inclusive growth for the better part of the last 5 or 10 years. I'm very, very proud not only to say, but to have been an integral part of a commitment that we made as an organization to the World Bank 5 years ago, back in 2015, to reach 500 million unbanked people around the globe and provide them access to private. Thank you. I'm looking at Sandie's head nodding. I love that. But providing them access to financial services to improve their health, their financial health and well-being around the globe. And obviously, if on average 50% of the human beings around the globe are women, we're naturally reaching out to also empower women. We very excitedly and proudly met that goal in the first quarter of this year. So we did, in fact, reach 500 million people with our programs and our products and services around the globe, in every region around the globe. And we really realized that was just the start of the journey. So we have re-upped our commitment. We have just recently gone live and extended our commitment out to 2025 to reach fully 1 billion, not only fully unbanked, but financially vulnerable and underbanked people as well by 2025. So we have another 500 million people to reach in the next 5 years. So our work's cut out for us, but we've also then extended that commitment to empowering 50 million micro and small merchants and enterprises around the globe, and including 25 million women-owned and operated businesses around the globe. So women entrepreneurs in the outreach. So, one of the things that's important to us is we can't provide financial tools to folks if the actual ecosystem is also not in place. So that, from our perspective, is that acceptance ecosystem, right? If you've got a digital payment product and tool, you have to have a merchant who can accept that form of payment. You have to be able to pay your light bill and your telecom bill and your school fees with that digital money. Otherwise, you just go back and you go to the nearest ATM and you cash it all out. You put the cash back in your pocket. And as a woman, especially, you are as vulnerable as you were. And we really haven't changed consumer behavior. So, to really take a step back, I started with your word of tools, but we at Mastercard, we really know that the advance of technology, which has moved faster in the last 5 years than it has moved in the 50 years that we as an organization have been in existence. But it creates great opportunity and has created great opportunity around the globe, but also significant challenges. So we are committed specifically to working towards a digital economy that works for everyone, everywhere, and that's men and women, because this is it's not a racial issue, it's not a gender issue, it's a global issue, but there are very, very specific, as we're seeing now through COVID, as we're seeing through Black Lives Matter, there are very specific gender disparities, there are very specific racial disparities that we absolutely need to focus on if we're going to bring everybody up together and forge new paths for both sustainable and inclusive economic growth, which we see as an imperative. So, one thing that we do know, if our focus and some of the buzzwords that we use all the time are around building an inclusive economy, it isn't just in developed or developing worlds alone, right? It's imperative for everybody. And that we see more and more. And I think, COVID has been the great equalizer, because I sit here in New York, for those around the globe who don't know, but obviously not only the United States, but New York, the hardest hit of any place around the globe at this point in time. We should have had the resources to protect our citizens against that. But the income and the opportunity disparity can be felt both at the individual level, for example, a single parent juggling multiple jobs and just working to make ends meet, as well as at the community level. So if we consider a town that's working to attract investment into distressed neighborhoods, and that's something that, is a very big topic of conversation right now, both pre-pandemic and obviously will be post-pandemic. But it's not just about helping those living in poverty, but also the struggling middle class who risk feeling increasingly left behind. And obviously, the percentage of women and single mothers that are a part of that. So what we see and what we know is that as the digital economy increasingly becomes the economy, and again, the current crisis is really has helped governments and economies around the globe realize that digitization not only has it helped, for social distancing. It's helped people who cannot now leave their homes to be able to transact via the internet. It's also helped for governments to disperse their stimulus payments into people's accounts and hands without having them need to, for example, go to the post office to collect a paper check and have to touch somebody's hands to get it and then take that to a payday lender. So all of these, global issues that we deal with from a financial perspective reach doubly across into the female community. So, just some examples of some programs that we've been working on around the globe. We are connecting farm holders to a digital marketplace in India, or unlocking micro credit for merchants in Kenya. And obviously, there are significant number of female smallholder farmers around the globe. We're also providing safe digital payments for garment workers in Egypt and Bangladesh and Cambodia, and helping gig workers in the US. And just to stop for a minute on garment and manufacturing workers, if we really look across the third world and the emerging countries where garment manufacturing predominates, it is largely a female enterprise. The garment and textile manufacturing factories around the globe are largely women, who are historically paid in cash. They go home. Very, very often, the husband takes that cash from them, will leave them a very, very small percentage of their earnings, with which they have to then put food on the table, clothes for the kids, pay school fees, pay the electricity, and maybe the husband goes off and drinks, maybe he does something else with it, but by giving them their pay in a digital form, either in a digital account, a mobile wallet account, or on a plastic card, it actually allows them and enables them to not only save, to bifurcate their savings, to parse out some that they can in fact take home and give to their husband as he expects to receive from them, but then begin saving, sending off to their family in other countries, which we know is hugely important. It came up earlier, helping them also understand the financial literacy training and education that we have to do as we put these new programs in the hands of people who have really never worked outside of a cash-based environment is essential. They need to know what to do. They need to know what to do at the ATM. They need to know what to do when they walk into a merchant who they don't know. Will you accept this card? Will you not accept this card? What do I do? So that's a big part of what we do around the globe. And
Okay,
thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Amazingly, even though this conversation around safety for women of finance and safety to hold their finance to themselves and not be in a situation of financial coercion with a partner, nevertheless, governments continue to get it wrong, although we've had this information for years. And the UK, for example, with universal credit, only gives a payment to a couple, to one of the people in that couple, meaning that if it's the man who gets the payment, then in some circumstances, too often, the female then has to sort of beg to get that money, or it's withheld from her. So we're still getting it wrong in so many ways, but but we do have the knowledge, and we just got to make sure it's distributed properly. Sandie, I want to come to you because we've seen probably the biggest fiscal input the world has ever seen in response to COVID. And at the same time, we have had headlines, particularly in the New York Times, about the she session, knowing that the women's economy is particularly hard hit. Women who were already in part-time work, women who were in freelance situations, women working in the poorest paid sectors, most likely to be made redundant, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, we have a huge fiscal package, unlike any we've ever seen. On the other hand, we have a she session. Is there any relationship between governments giving out these huge amounts of money and them actually paying attention to giving it to women to make sure that they don't plummet down further in an already perilous situation?
Thank you very much, Jude. It's great to be back into the WOW family again and to meet Laura for the first time and see Arlene again. Great question. Before I dive in to answer that, I just want to say a couple of things, if I may. It's really clear we are in a time of change, undoubtedly. I think the pandemic, coupled with George Floyd's death and the aftermath of that, means that we're in a moral moment of change. And we have to, both of those are very, very tragic things, but I think we have to move with the momentum of that to make this century a better century. And when you look particularly at women, I mean, when we started this century, there was a long way to go for women to achieve equality. And everyone was saying it won't be till the end of the century and everything, which I never really believed had to be the case. But now one of the challenges that we're in is because of the pandemic, is women falling further behind. So some of the advances that have been made, particularly advances in economic empowerment, can go backwards. So I think there are about 740 million women in the world who are in the informal economy. Okay, and many of them in the developing parts of the world that the World Bank deals with, and they're very hard to reach, and they're very hard to bank, and they're very hard to get into the formal economy, and many of them are in the service industry. And lots of strides that have been made in recent years to eradicate poverty across the world have also been taken backwards because of this pandemic. So anything that we see at all that sees progress that has been made go backward, affects women more than it affects men, full stop. And because we have progressed less. So this is very worrying in many ways. And I think we need to make sure that everything we put in place, either because of the pandemic or as a result of Black Lives Matter, we have a gender lens to it. That's just something that is really very important. It's quite clear we're heading for a recession. It's going to be the worst recession since the Second World War. Again, women are going to be overly affected across the world than men. So we need to think about that when we think about how we're going to tackle that recession. What means we put in place to deal with that from an economic perspective, we've got to do it with the gender lens. Because otherwise, we will think, instead of going forward in this century, we will really go backwards in that regard. And so at the bank, for example, we've had to react very quickly to the COVID pandemic. We're getting about, I think it's 160 billion out to our member countries to help with this pandemic. That's a lot of money. But in every single project and every single grant, we are making sure that there is a gender lens to the work that is being done. And I'll give you one example. In Pakistan, for example, we're supporting a project that gives mobile phones to women so they can start digital businesses, because we recognise that's really important. So I think that gender lens, and I can't say this strongly enough, on everything that we do from an economic perspective, because we can't pretend it's the same. This pandemic has changed everything. And women have probably suffered most from it, from an economic perspective, because they have probably had to stay home more when the schools closed with children and childcare. So that's been a huge effect. They have probably been in service industries as well, so they have probably been quite affected. And when things get back to normal, what's going to happen then? When children are still at home for longer than we expected. So I think it's worrying times when it comes to women's economic empowerment. But we can worry less if we realise that and address it from the get-go. And when I see the work that I do around the world, one of the things we mustn't take for granted is that women all over the world have access to the same things. Women in rural communities are much more disadvantaged than women in cities. So again, lumping people together, we have to be very careful about. And I remember being told a story about mobile phones, that's great for access to a number of things. But in some rural communities, that mobile phone could be taken away from the woman because the man might believe he deserves that mobile phone rather than her. So we've got to remember that things don't fall equally, across the globe and for women, but they do take more of the burden. And without economic empowerment, without access to their own financial funds, they're more susceptible to domestic violence. They're more, and I must say, I do worry about the fact that obviously schools have closed across the world, but women and young girls particularly often don't have access to education in the first place. So this is a real further cut-off point, and we're probably going to see many more girls marry early and have early pregnancies as a result of COVID because of not going to school. And in some parts of the world, the average time of going to school is 8 years, and that I think is being cut by another half year. And that will affect girls even more, and further down the line, the economic empowerment, early marriage, and this planned poverty. So I think it's a continuum, Jude, I would say here, that not one, and I was really interested in what Eileen said and Laura said, But we have a real challenge now to make sure that no one is left behind as we move forward. Because technology will leap. I mean, look at us all here today. We never thought we would do something like this. We were usually all in the same room in the South Bank doing this, or where else in the world. But we've made this huge leap, and even in the justice system, and I know others are talking about that, technology is starting to be used in courts, which makes it more accessible. So we've got to think, how do we make financial services, finance more accessible? We could get rid of some of the jargon for a start. And I'll finish on this note, we should have more women in financial services, full stop, to make sure that we are designing the right products for women all through. Many are there, but they're not in the operational front line roles. You'll find them in roles like mine in legal or in something else, but in the front line operational roles, the design of the products, we need more women there. I'll stop there.
Okay, so Sandie, Laura, Arlene, you've all been incredibly cogent and wise, and you know the problems. And if you three were running all the banks and all the governments and all the necessary methods of getting stuff out, then we'd be fine. But you're not. And so, again, when I said, Sandie, here's the biggest fiscal input the world has ever seen, coming from governments of all kinds of persuasions. And then here's the evidence that the people who are most likely to be affected by COVID are the already less resilient half of the world, which are women. Do those two things go together? I don't think so at the moment, because certainly the UK government, it's often an afterthought that, oh yes, we mustn't forget about women in the economy. And so I suppose, just coming to you again, Sandie, before I come back to Arlene, which is this conversation happening at the topmost level? And are there, are the men basically who run most of the economic situations in the world, are they turning their attention to women and going, if we do nothing else, we are going to solve female financial jeopardy?
I don't think they are having that conversation, if I'm honest.
Right.
I don't think, well, that's what I meant about a gender lens on the issue, is that has to be that's got to be one of the top priorities when we're having this discussion, and we're having this discussion about life post-COVID and how we're going to solve this. It's an afterthought.
Okay.
And I mean an afterthought in the sense that once you've designed something, then you look at how it affects, and that's too far down the road. It needs to be, but then you need more women in the room to bring this in as a discussion, rather than this is one of the boxes we need to tick. This is the box. This is the lens. We have to look at it this way. But I don't think those discussions are happening, if I'm honest.
Okay,
Jude,
let's
could
be
I
honest.
interrupt?
Laura.
The point that Sandie's just made is so spot on. What we talk about, and I think this conversation is validating, is that too much of our world has been designed without women in mind and without women involved in the decision making. Full stop. And so as Sandie was trying to answer the question from you, I think that's simply a fact that we have to change.
So the reason why I'm asking, to be honest, Arlene, is because we haven't got time anymore in the world to hop around. We've got to be honest, and therefore, because if we look at the problems honestly, we can then think, well, how quickly can we get to the solutions? Arlene, not enough women at top level, not enough women have ever designed the financial systems, not enough men are aware of what's needed. How are we going to change that? Arlene, how are you going to change that?
Well, I do think it is imperative that we take an approach that is one that is not just focused on it's the right thing to do. I think it's important for us to tell the story of why it's beneficial for everyone in the world for women to participate in a global economy in an equitable way. I mean, the information about the benefit to GDP of getting gender parity is that's undeniable. I also think, similar to what you're seeing in the context of Black Lives Matter, if you think about what I said around the purchasing power that women have, there's $20 trillion per year that cannot be ignored. And so if we were more collaborative in terms of our approach and ask the question of every company that we buy from, what's your position not only in the context of we buy and bank from, right? And so what's your position in the context of how you allocate capital to women-owned businesses? And do you purchase from women-owned businesses? In the same way, we have to do that to solve some of the racial disparity that exists. And we cannot just wait for people to wake up and decide that that's the right thing to do. We've got to take action on our own.
Okay, Sandie.
I couldn't agree with that more, and it made me think that how, I don't know the answer to this, but how many women have there been in the room when the solution and the decisions around COVID and the response and the fiscal response? I mean, across the world, probably not very many. Who's going to bear the brunt of those decisions? Women. We have a vote. We should be insisting that we have more representation across the board, from government to, we have the buying power vote in many different ways. But we also have a vote when it comes to those that represent us. And it's clear we're really underrepresented. So when these solutions are thought of, we're not in the room either with the solutions. And we do have a say, but sometimes we don't realize how much of a say we have. And I think this current time is a time to remember that. And I think Black Lives Matter have taught us that you can change things relatively quickly. People's thinking, sit back and think, that's not fair. But we can vote as well to have better representation. I think that's really important.
I think you're right to say
that the energy. Jude, I was just saying, you're the marketplace. Why don't we have that sort of campaign as it relates to women-owned businesses, right?
Yeah.
We should be thinking about things like that at a grassroots level.
Yeah.
We have to organize. I mean, the thing is that the moral imagination that Black Lives Matter has brought to the civic space has caught up everybody. It's made everybody kind of go, I have to think, I have to take responsibility, I have to stand alongside. And we have to do that about everything to do with girls and women now. Because if we don't, we will see the tide cover up so much of the progress that's been made. And, that work has been so crucial and so hard won. We can't let it go backwards. And also, this is a time, as you say, Sandie, for change. And I can say, as maybe the oldest person here, I'm not sure, but I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime a moment that women at all levels of society have been prepared to call it out. This would have been a more polite conversation, if you like, 5 years ago. We don't have time to be polite in that way. And as women, we have to take responsibility. We see ourselves through a gender lens. And sometimes that gender lens, we've been taught to see ourselves as, behaving well, being quiet, being accommodating. And those things haven't stood us in good stead. I mean, one of the things that's really happened about COVID as well is that women have realized that they've been back inside the house, back doing childcaring, back doing cooking, cleaning, all the things that they've paid other women to do. And that those other women that were being paid at the lowest level of society. So suddenly people are realizing that how can we value what women do if we pay them so little? And how can women say they stand shoulder to shoulder with other women if we are part of that poverty economy? So there's a lot of things that we need to take a reckoning on between us. And, I just want us to have the courage. I think it's time. And I think with the expertise of people like Mastercard and the World Bank and Moody's, the data, the knowledge, the experience, but also the personalities and knowledge of the women within them, like yourselves, we can bring real shared leadership to the space. And I mean, I think that will be the really exciting change that we could make come about. I mean, I'd like to think that was true. We're going to take a break now. Obviously, these three women are going to go off and solve the world economy right this minute. They've all picked up the baton and off they're going. So Laura, Mackenzie, thank you. Sandie, Okoro, thank you. Arlene, Isaac Lowe, thank you so much. You're brilliant women, and I know you'll carry on working on everybody's behalf.